Hello, everyone. My name is Peer from the Lean Hire podcast. And today I'm very happy to have Pranay with me from my Winter 19 batch last year at Y Combinator. Pranay, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Spear. Great to be here.
And so you have a very interesting background personally for me because some of you might know I'm a huge fan of Next.js. Um, Tim was actually saying that I'm his biggest fan now. I hope this is something I can say to Pranay. He's also a friend of Tim, one of the maintainers of Next.js. And you actually worked at back in the days it was called Zeit. You worked at Versal, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I worked at Zeit, and it's still hard for me to call it Vercel because I'm just so used. But
Yeah, they recently got a rebranding. Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of crazy. My LinkedIn just automatically changed to say Vercel, and it was funny to see that. But
Oh, okay, perfect.
so
And tell me, shit, my webcam. Tell me more about your time at Versal. Like when did you start working there, and how was it like working remote for the first time?
sure. So in 2017, that's when I started working at Vercel. I was still in school, so I initially just spoke to Guillermo and wanted to do an internship there. And we started talking about internships, and so the hiring process at Vercel was super interesting, where
Yeah,
it's similar to what you're doing with Lean Hire, where I had to work on saw like a work trial for a few months, did a bunch of open source, and even like got to the point where we like published a blog post even before I was an employee there.
wow.
And so I worked on a bunch of cool things, and that was all remote. That was my first time working with the team like that, working remotely. And also I was in school, so it was sort of like this part-time thing where I'd work after classes or sometimes during classes. And that's when I got, so that was my first taste of remote work as well, but that's when I started to work with Vercel. So even though it was a 3-month internship, I sort of worked with them for a year. If I remember correctly, I spoke to Tim. Once I joined the Slack initially, he just messaged me one of those first days, introduced himself because we both joined Vercel about the same time, but he was
Hmm.
joining full for Next.js. I was just, doing work trials at the time. Um, and so that's kind of how I got into Vercel and spent a year working for them mostly remotely from college. About 3 months of that was during the summer. I did move to San Francisco and worked with them at the office. And at the time, I think Vercel was about 12 to 13 employees. So only three of us were really at the office. Most of the company was remote. We had people all across the world.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so it was this fun hybrid experience. My only experience before that was working at Facebook. And so it was totally the opposite. You had like thousands of people in the same building. And it was just like so different.
And what was the biggest difference for like coming from Facebook to going like a hybrid remote company that's like very, I'd say like small back in the days, like 13 people. What would you say was the biggest difference and like the biggest cons and different, like the biggest pros?
Yeah, sure. So the very first thing, obviously, is just the amount of ownership you have between things, right? As an intern, I felt like I was creating repos from scratch. And that was just really cool that I would start a project completely from scratch and be able to contribute to this thing and sort of own code really fast. At Facebook, it's obviously much harder, and you work within a much narrower, a much like smaller,
More restrictions. Yeah.
more
Yeah.
restriction, right? And Facebook's not too bad about it. You sort of get to expand. And I was working open source at Facebook, so again, it's a little bit different. Like I was working on a
Yeah.
GraphQL, and so you have a little bit more ownership. But Vercel was definitely like far apart, and there was 13 people, so there was no hierarchy. I was working directly with the CEO. Everybody was working directly with the CEO. And so I felt like just in the amount of time I spent at Vercel, I learned a lot really, really fast. I learned a lot about engineering. I learned a lot about like people management and working with people remotely. And I felt like even as an intern there, I never felt like an intern, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was leading projects and working with others, as good as a full-time engineer. And that
Yeah.
felt
Yeah.
amazing.
I had Jack from Copa yesterday on the podcast, and we were talking about the similarities of lean hiring and internships. And I think this is very, very interesting that even Versal at that stage was doing internships, especially remote. And as you said, it was a very similar process. Like it was
I
starting
don't think
very early.
I don't think they were doing internships till I called and asked if they can do an internship just for me.
Oh, really? You were the first one.
I was the first one. I
Wow.
remember pestering Guillermo, and I think the company was only 2 years old. I remember pestering him. I sent him a few fan emails, which I never got responses to. I eventually met somebody at Facebook who was a mutual friend with Guillermo, and I pestered him to introduce me to Guillermo. And I remember our very first phone call, I was just like very fascinated with the open source work they did.
Yeah.
And I like to think I convinced him in that call to bring me on. So
That's a cool story. And for those of you who are listening, that's much like this is happening much more often than you think. Like if there's a company that's not doing any interns, just ping them. Like be the
yeah,
most annoying person and try to find someone inside that company who you might connect to. Like nowadays with LinkedIn, it's yeah, as easy as
yeah.
as it can.
So a really
So
fun story, just on that point I wanted to add was around the same time I emailed Vercel and was just trying to, pester Guillermo into giving me an internship. I was also doing the same thing with Dylan from Figma.
mhm.
And so I just played with Figma once. I really liked the app. And I was just like, so there's a few products like that where I've just been so impressed by the app. But the first thing I've done is just sent an email to the CEO.
Right.
So I sent an email just, I got an email. It was like I was in the beta for Figma, and I got an email from Dylan. All the beta users did. So I responded back to the email and was like, "Hey, can I work at Figma?" And he was just surprised by that. So we got into a call. He was pretty excited. I went through the interview. I failed. I did it again the next year. So this was the same time. That was during Facebook, and I did the same thing again the next year when I was at
Right.
Vercel. Called him, went and met him at the office. Again, failed the interview, but both those times I just kind of met Dylan, got pretty close to him, and so it was funny, messaging him out of the blue, asking for a job. And again, I think I would have been the first intern there as well. I think Figma was at 30 employees at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's kind of
That's
crazy.
yeah, that's
Definitely
cool.
not
It's cool
going
how to
out.
get your like sort of like your foot in these type of companies. And now Versal went to raise the first bigger round, like seed round, Series A,
You
and
won. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's amazing. When I met you and Tim last year, I didn't had any idea about Next.js or Versal or anything of in that space. I didn't even know what Jamstack is, and now this whole year I just spent so much time in that space and looking at these type of companies. And one of the interesting talking points I had with Jack was someone said you need to be in the Bay Area to build like a successful company. And even in YC, I got some no's from investors, which is fine, to say you need to be in the Bay Area. You cannot survive as a remote company. And then there's the argument, well, Airbnb or Facebook could have never become that company if they were like fully remote. But I think the most interesting thing that most people don't like see is that it's been different times. Like when these companies got started, maybe there wasn't like this Zoom, like this interest in Zoom or in good video conferencing tools and collaborative Figma and collaborative Google Docs. So what do you think now looking at Versal, and you spend like a year there? What do you think is their outlook? Like they still hire remote, they still want to, like, again, Tim is open source and somewhere in the world and traveling a lot. And I imagine the whole team is sort of like
Yeah, definitely.
remote and hybrid remote. That statement of like the next big companies, I think it's not like correct anymore. And I would like to hear your
Yeah.
point on that, because you've been working at the company, but also at Facebook, and now you have your own startup, which we want to go into in a second. But what's your viewpoint on that statement?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like I've gone back and forth on this quite a bit. I started out with the exact same ideas, which was you can't start a company like Facebook or Google without, like, if you watched Social Network, it's just like saw the feel of like everybody in the office. You can get into arguments and like yell at each other and like
Yeah, the whiteboard sessions. Yeah.
whiteboard sessions. Yeah. I remember always seeing those, like, as a kid, I was in awe of those pictures of like the Google headquarters with like beanbags everywhere. And it was just cool, for me to see as a kid. And that sounded really cool. I always felt like that's where innovation happens. Like you have to be with a bunch of people. And I obviously during college, I also did a bunch of hackathons, and it felt very much like that,
Yeah.
I guess sort of like, I called it the pre-Slack era, where software hadn't reached the point where you can just collaborate so easily with software. I think that was really the blocker at the time. And so when Facebook started and Google started, we didn't have good enough software to do that. You didn't have like amazing video calling. You didn't have like good whiteboard apps, and now all that's improved. But the second thing that I've noticed more recently is when Facebook was hiring, or when Google was hiring its first employees, it was a very, very different time. You didn't have, Facebook didn't have to compete with Facebook in terms of salaries and in terms of like location and stuff. And if you're in the Bay Area now and you're trying to hire in the Bay Area now, it's pretty hard because you are competing with companies like Airbnb and Facebook and Brex and people who can, obviously pay a lot of money, but also give you, free food and kitchens and this like
Right.
crazy work environment and all the other bonuses you get from working at a large office in the South Bay. Um, I think that's changed. And so now when you're trying to hire from the talent pool, it's first really hard to hire people specifically from the Bay Area and just try to
Yeah.
get, uh, you know, you want the smartest people. And today they're not necessarily in the Bay Area, and then you're overpaying in the Bay Area. And so first, yeah, it is a thing about money, but you're also missing out on this like super talented talent pool that's outside of the Bay Area and just can't make it here, right? And that's for multiple reasons. It's expensive to live in the Bay Area, but also getting a visa. That's one thing I've seen. And I'm an international
Yeah,
student.
I failed 3 times. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
it's seriously hard, right? And so if you fail getting to the US 3 times, people who are only hiring locally are going to miss out on your talent.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so I definitely think that's so
It's
one
a
of the
great
reasons.
summary. Yeah, I definitely have these like when I was becoming like when I was doing more in tech and I saw these like documentaries about Apple and Google, and it was just so like energizing to see all these smart people in the rooms, in the offices, and like whiteboarding sessions. So I definitely see that picture. I still have that, but I've also seen the opposite where when I was in YC, I was the only one, and we had a team of 7 in Germany, and over the course of 7 months stuff was still working, and even then we had people in different cities in Germany. So I think when I got into YC and was talking to other colleagues, everyone was like, yeah, we need to have an office in San Francisco, we need to be here, we need to it's fine, we can raise a bigger round to offset like the high living costs. And I thought this was like always like it was always the need to raise like these huge valuations just to have the same amount of runway. And I think this will change. Like first we talked, like we've seen investors and insights to in like funding rounds that some
Yeah,
valuations are sort of going down, like not really, but then it's definitely, there is definitely some sort of correction coming.
the
Um,
wake of work.
yeah, basically. But I also see that funding rounds just get a little smaller because you just don't need that much of much money if you don't have an office, if you hire brilliant people from around the world. So there's so many different dynamics coming up. And I think what I want to ask you is, so you've done YC about a year ago with me.
Yeah.
What has changed for you? Like just not only your situation, you're still in the Bay Area in San Francisco, but also like the outlook. Let's say your company is like really, really taking off in the next 10 years. Will you be hiring in an office? Will you stay in the Bay Area? Like, what's your outlook for now?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, like I said, this is, I've gone back and forth on this. And even last year, I was having discussions we were thinking about hiring somebody to our team. And we had a lot of discussions with him just about so like, what he thinks about remote hiring. And at the time, I was still like a staunch believer that working at an office was how you like innovate and you can't build a company like Facebook. Those are all of my arguments, a year or so
Yeah.
ago. But now, especially with COVID going on and with the current pandemic, I just think that's impractical. And yeah, nowadays you can't limit yourself to that. And so with Windsor, just thinking about the future, I've obviously changed my viewpoint, pretty much like a 180 in about a year, and seeing how different this is, and hearing about companies like Facebook even say that 10 years from now they're going to try to be like more than half the company is going to be remote. And
Yeah.
seeing all of my friends who I still know from Facebook all working remotely now, and them being as productive as ever. Like Facebook is still releasing all my old teams at Relay and GraphQL and React. They're still pushing these updates like all the time, and I still talk to all of them and just see how amazingly productive they are. I don't
Wow.
think we lost anything
Yeah.
from remotely, and so I don't think that's a constraint that we'll care about in the
Yeah.
future. I might change my mind on that again, but I don't foresee it happening. Yeah.
It's definitely, well, it's definitely a good trade to just observe all options. And I think I'm I'm very what's like I'm leading towards the hybrid where you have an office for the people who want to go, and then you enable like infinite amount of work from home just like
Yeah, so
you
I
can
have a
get the
few
stuff
thoughts
done.
on that. I have a few thoughts on that actually. From my time at Vercel, there were definitely pros and cons to having like a hybrid because Vercel was sort of a hybrid company.
Yeah,
We had an office in San Francisco. There was at the time, it was 13 people. So there was three of us, on most days, three of us working out of the office, and occasionally we'd have people fly in. So we kept having like a rotating series of people that we had across the world who would
right.
fly in and work out of the office for 2 months, and we'd have somebody else. So usually would go up to like five people out of the office, and during events we'd have everybody at the office. So if it was definitely a very hybrid company. We had like at times half the company was in the office and maybe half the company was around the world. And I think there were a few pros and cons to that. The biggest issue, I think, just looking back at that, was it sometimes felt like people were missing out on a conversation, right? So if you have a few people in the office and they spontaneously have a discussion and then come up with like this whole new spec on how to do things or come up
Right.
with a new plan, everyone who's not in the office definitely feels like they're missing out. And it's hard to, if you were completely remote, then you can only have discussions by having a meeting, which
Yeah.
obviously slows things down a little bit, but you at least don't have people missing out on things. And so that was one of the issues. But there were also quite a few pros. When we did have meetings, and we had like, a planned meeting where we had a few people in the office together, and then we had people on a video call as well. One thing I noticed just really quickly that was incredibly useful, where there were times where one of us was trying to make a point, over a video call. And so I was in person, I was trying to make a point to everybody else over this video call, and if I couldn't get my words right, if I couldn't explain this well, somebody next to me understood well enough that they could, help me convey that message. And so
Yeah.
the meetings that do go well go like extremely well because everybody is in, a few people are in the same room. And especially when you have people all across the world who, and English isn't everybody's native language, it really helps to have, some diversity there in person. Um, so I'm not sure how I feel, but there are definitely pros and cons to like a
Yeah.
hybrid.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, if it would be clear, then we wouldn't have these conversations about like how we move
Yeah,
forward in like the future of work. So I'm very, very interested in how the workspace is evolving, and I think as long as everyone has like they're like has an open mind on how things change, and it's totally fine to get like go in one direction or the other or have a hybrid. But yeah, I think this whole pandemic and even post pandemic, like I don't want to see this as a temporary trend. Like I doubt that a lot of people who move now will go back to their original city,
yeah,
especially with kids and families. So I'm definitely intrigued by this whole change. But talking about Windsor, so we met in YC,
yeah,
and Windsor has at least one pivot.
yeah. I think
I
we pivoted.
think.
We
Yeah, I
primarily,
think yeah,
yeah,
I think it was a oh, I remember it was a C
we,
a
yeah,
code
we, no,
IDE. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
It was,
IDE
It's
tool.
an
Yeah.
assistant for an IDE. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
kind of like CP from Microsoft Word for tech for like VS Code.
Yeah, like a smart extension that like understands your docs, etc., and syncing up. And I thought, well, actually, I tried it and I thought it was kind of interesting. But your next pivot, which was coming up in YC, that got my eye. And I was actually a user of Windsor
Yeah,
when I was still running Mage. And we had to churn because we literally shut down the services, and we probably wouldn't have churned.
for the
Um,
workplace.
so
Yeah,
tell me more about what are you working on right now?
absolutely. So Windsor today is we're trying to build an analytics platform that's targeted towards startups. So the idea for this was there were a lot of analytics tools. We saw everybody during YC pick up something like use something like Segment and then send all their data to Mixpanel or Amplitude or Heap, and there's plenty more analytics solutions
Yeah,
out there. And when we started looking at this, it always sort of felt like these tools were primarily built for companies that had like thousands of users, and you were like A/B testing features, and you had these graphs and funnels and segments, and all those are going to be useful and really cool. But we felt like we were missing out on this whole market of like all these founders in YC who are just trying to figure out their first like 100 users or their first 1,000 users,
right.
and and so the YC sentiment is like talk to your users and the users, and so you're thinking about individual users. You're not thinking about these aggregate graphs where everything
Yeah,
sort of gets lost in the numbers. And so we wanted to build a solution that works there, and we wanted to start from the ground up, build something that we wanted to use And so the cool thing from Windsor from day one has been we completely do our analytics on Windsor. So as we've been growing from 0 to 1 and then 1 to 10, we've been like building Windsor for ourselves, and also all of our customers are at the same stage as us. So when we signed you up, it was a really cool experience because we immediately jumped to like somebody who had like a few thousand active users, and we're trying to scale that, and also you were trying to figure
Yeah,
out
I
users.
remember. That was fun times. And I think when someone's asking me like the difference between like let's say Google Analytics or Amplitude and Windsor, it's like I think it's summarized by like numbers versus faces.
Yeah,
And what
that's
I
a great.
think when you think about like Amplitude, you see a graph and you see a plot, but you don't really know what's behind that. Like it's just a number. Like is that a good number if it's going up? Is it a bad number if it's going down? Like that's the binary idea, like
Yeah.
outcomes. And the special thing, and that's also something that Intercom has like been pushing in the market, is that you want to treat every single user as like a friend, as like someone who you can have a meaningful conversation with, ask them about feedback, especially the first 100 like users. So many people, and that's like it's the mantra in YC, but even entrepreneurs outside of YC are just learning now that this is so important to treat everyone like a special friend, and
I,
get their needs and everything. So this has
I
been
think
really impressive. Yeah.
ideally on like an early startup, you want to run your, and yeah, I'm kind of stealing this quote from somebody else, but you want to run your startup like a restaurant or like a shopkeeper, right?
Yeah.
You don't have crazy analytics on A/B testing your food recipes and stuff. Like you don't have like great numbers in these. You just meet people every day. You meet your users. The chef walks out sometimes, talks to customers there. Your servers get to learn a lot from just talking to customers, serving them, and just understanding what their needs and dislikes are. You upgrade like the space and stuff like that. And there every person, everyone who walks in the door is someone you can see. You can see everything that they do.
Yeah.
If your stores use this to their advantage, where like supermarkets move items around and like change layouts to adapt to like the way people buy stuff. But these aren't from like video cameras capturing analytics. These are from people really working at the store and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
seeing what works and
Talking
what
to
doesn't.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, and that works great when you're, especially when you're like working at small numbers. But I really believe that large companies lose touch with those, and they could be a lot better if they knew how individual customers felt. And that's what we're trying to do, right? So when you log into Windsor, the main view isn't this dashboard. It's an event feed. It looks just like Messenger or WhatsApp. You see all of your users. You can click on your users, see everything they've done, all the conversations with you, all of their like transactions, what's worked, what's failed. And all of our conversations with users are always like, if I wanted to call you and talk to you about your experience with Windsor, I would pull up Windsor, look at your profile for a little bit, sort of see like what your activity has been like for the past week. And then I can have a really meaningful conversation. It's like, oh, what do you think about this feature? I noticed you were using it, like 20 minutes ago.
Yeah,
And
and I think that's amazing. Yeah, and it's just so necessary for not only like startups, but moving forward if you're not in the same office. I remember when like we had a lot of customer support as an e-commerce company with like a marketplace. So one of our main use cases was just like looking into the data, and then like picking people who had like a bad like a an error in their shopping cart and stuff. And
yeah,
I remember that before that, we would just like, someone would send me an email and I was sitting in the office and I would just read this email and say, hey, yo, somehow the shopping cart is not working. Like I would shout it across the room. And then he was like, yeah, which user is that? And I would just like send him like the user ID or the email address of the user by like Slack or something. And it was just so inefficient, and that's in the office. So I think
yeah.
how can like remote teams or just teams in general use Windsor for their advantage?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, it's exactly the point that you brought up. We have a few companies that are working completely remotely and benefit from Windsor. And one of the first things we noticed, actually, just using Windsor, one of the first things we noticed is we'd look at people, we'd look at people's like activity feed and like what they were doing on Windsor, and suddenly we started to see the spike of just people that wouldn't connect to Windsor, that wouldn't that wouldn't go to the normal like login flow and then go to the user feed and like search for a user in the tab. They would go straight to a user ID. Like the first page they would open up was a user ID. And so what we immediately realized, just looking at some more of the data, was okay, we had people that would kind of like do some research, find a user, and then they would send that over to somebody else on Slack or Messenger, and they would automatically open up to Windsorio with the correct event of like, hey, this
Yeah.
issue, this person had this issue. So somebody sends you an intercom message and says, hey, this thing is broken. You can send someone on the engineering team that link, and now they can see the intercom conversation directly with like one link. And that's been useful for remote teams, right? It's much easier to collaborate. And I don't think Winds is unique to that. All the software, Google
Yeah.
Doc, and,
Yeah.
also Amplitude and Segment and SaaS tools, like Stripe or Twilio, like all of these have been doing a good job with that. It's just easier to share permalinks. And I think permalinks are super important for teams. Yeah.
It's actually circling back to Versal and Next. It's actually one of the key features I use when we use like Versal, that you can just like get this unique URL and send it to someone, and you see the logs like there is a build error. And I imagine this is like so similar to Windsor, where you say, oh, this user has this session error, copy like this permanent link, and it will always stay the same, and you have like the highlight of the event. And one thing I remember was that you can connect different services, and you get like the same data from like Stripe, from SendGrid, from all these different services inside Windsor. And I found that was really cool.
Yeah, thank you.
And so I would love to use Windsor for my next company. I don't know what the company is going to look like. But yeah, if you want to reach out to Pranay, feel free to like leave a handle if you want to, or a website. Like, now's your time.
Windsorio.io. There's a waiting list right now you can sign up for, or just message me at team@windsorio.io, and we'll try to skip the waiting list.
Awesome. And you are in San Francisco right now, is that correct?
San Francisco right now. We might not be. We might be remote.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thanks so much, Pierre. Yeah, it was great.
Cool. Okay. Bye.
See you.